So let me welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to have the first event this year with this book presentation of a book edited by Isabelle Anguelovski and James Connolly, who are gladly here, and I'm very happy to see them. The Green City and Social Justice, 21 Tales from North America and Europe. And I'm very happy also that Dagmar Haase agreed to act as a discussant. I will very briefly present you to the audience, and then I will give the floor to you for your presentation. So Isabelle Anguelovski is the director of a Barcelona Laboratory for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, which is quite a unique lab. And I don't know if it was founded around your ERC grant and then developed out of that, but in any case, it's a topic you have been working for quite some time and are one of the main reference persons in the international debate about environmental justice, together also with James, which co-directed the center until he was, I don't know if you still co-directed or only until you were in Barcelona, but we will see. She studied in France at Harvard, in the US, and obtained a PhD in urban studies and planning from the MIT before returning to Europe with a Marie Curie fellowship. And she's working mainly on the topic of a book, actually, about which she published quite a lot, environmental justice, but also in particularly focusing on the impact of environmental policies and green policies in general, in terms of gentrification, inequality, health, equity, the distributive impact of climate policies, etc. So thank you very much for being with us today, Isabelle. James Connolly, who was previously in Barcelona, is now at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, where he's an assistant professor, and he's working on similar issues, of course. He got a PhD in Columbia. I don't know if it was still the time where Susan Feinstein was there. In any case, I saw that Susan congratulated you for the book on Facebook when we advertised the event today. And his research is more maybe on the planning part, but actually the socio-ecological conflicts are a key theme for him. And last but not least, Dagmar Haase, today, who kindly agreed to act as a discussant. She's a professor for landscape ecology at Humboldt University in Berlin. And she has a PhD in urban geoecosystems. I don't know if it is the correct wording in English, from the University of Leipzig in Germany. She worked for quite some time at the Helmholtz Zentrum für Umweltforschung there. And she works actually also on some very technical issues, so urban ecosystem services, impact assessment, and other stuff, but also on well-being, green spaces, so with a more, let's say, social touch on the topic. And all three actually contributed with quite some very recent publication on the impact of COVID-19. Of course, that's a hot topic for everybody. On public space, on health, well-being, and issues which were heavily affected by the pandemic. I would say I stop here. If you want, you can Google their profile, and Google Scholar will give you all the publications and everything. You will have, as I said, half an hour, 40 minutes for your presentation, then we will start the discussion with Dagmar Haase. Thanks a lot for being with us, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Yuri. Dagmar as well. We've known Dagmar, James and I, for quite a while through our work at PCNUEJ, through colleagues at ICTA as well, so it's really super great. And Dagmar, you are one of the main scholars also and inspirators of EJ research in Europe. So it was really nice to also learn from your work, as I think James and I both came back to Europe quite a few years ago. Quick question, James, can I share my slides if we do it as we usually do it? I don't feel I can present on San Francisco very well. All right.
perfect.
Okay. All right. So thank you so much for being here today, everyone. The book is a great honor and a great pleasure for James and I to present, because it's a large collective endeavor that represents the work of all of our colleagues, 90% of all of our colleagues at the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability. It brings together field work from almost 30 researchers who are both core members of the lab, but also who have been collaborators across fieldwork and across research sites over the years. And so we're really pleased to also show the book on their behalf. The reason, one of the main ways in which we conceived the book as a tale-focused book is because of our common interest in the history of urban environmental injustice, the ways in which historic lack of access to a healthy environment, to green space, to healthy food, transportation, etc., has then morphed into different types of inequalities that are linked with the history and the drivers of urban development. And so our interest here in showing in many of the tales how urban environmental injustice are born, how they evolve over time, how similar they might be across sites, and also what are the main drivers and structural causes that perpetuate them over time. Our focus on North America and Europe comes from a few projects that we've had at the lab that have really looked at urban and equal city, or the urban and equal city and justice in those two regions. Both James and I were trained in the US. We came to Europe, and there's always been an interest in studying, in really exploring the ways in which urban environmental injustice pan out in the European concept. For example, the commonalities and difference around race, around immigration, the question of segregation and exclusion in the city, lack of knowledge recognition for some groups, etc., and the ways in which environmental movements really play a different role in their support or in their advocacy towards a greater green and just city. And so this focus is, it's a disclaimer also, it's a focus on North America and Europe for this variety of reasons, for also wanting to bring academics, social movements, planners interested in furthering this issue of urban environmental justice together, closer together, but we recognize that we're not covering, obviously, all of the areas of the world where the unjust green city is manifested. So as I said, we are a Barcelona-based lab, a little bit with 2 or 3 different main umbrella sites, I would say now. James in Vancouver, myself in Barcelona, other colleagues in Northern Europe, Frances Barrault, for example, in Brussels. And so the way in which we've approached our work is coming at it, and I think that's also reflecting in the book, from a variety of disciplines: urban environmental planning, sociology and geography, urban political ecology, the political economy of development, and public health. That's also very much a part of our work, not only because of the history of urban environmental justice and how health has historically been the main marker, the main indicator of urban environmental injustice, but also because of the ways in which planning for the green city, by the way in which it is becoming a branded identity, is also becoming a branded identity because of the ways in which planners and elected officials brand the green city as a healthy city. And so what we're trying to debunk here also a little bit is that whose health is being supported through greening the city. We also like to share a bit some of the values, some of the principles around which we work, including the ethics of care in academia, and really thinking about different types of pathways of knowledge, of needs that academia and that academics also would like to strive towards, etc. The research that we do, much of it is embedded in the book. Of course, environmental and climate gentrification is probably one of the main themes, one of the main theories around which we work our different case studies, but of course, the questions of environmental conflicts as well, the role of financialization of housing rights, in particular, the question of urban environment, health, and equity, and then the global reach, let's say, of some planetary orthodoxy or urban infrastructures. And so the main question we try to answer is the following: how can urban planning as a field move away from urban greening being embedded in politics of unequal redevelopment, competitive urbanism, and land speculation? And in that sense, how is a particular way of doing planning, which is greening the city, bringing nature back into the city, become a truly just and emancipatory goal for all rather than a driver of new social and racial injustices? And that was also very important for us in the book, which is, okay, there's so much press, there is so much media attention, so many organizations, ICLEI, Metropolis, UCLG, focusing on the importance of greening the city, but without necessarily politicizing what it means to green cities, that this is a book that should really centrally look at the inequality within the green city, whether it is created by greening the city or whether this inequality is being exacerbated by greening projects. And so one of the particularly important lenses for us is the question of segregation and racism as an indicator of structural inequality that is really probably the primary experience, that is the primary indicator of injustice through which we are working. And so the hypothesis here, or the claim that we make, is that unequal access to green space before and today, environmental racism and housing discrimination are deeply intertwined historically, and this relationship continues to persist. How do we see this? We see this then historically in a case like Barcelona, where access to urban green infrastructure was, of course, of lower quality, of lower quantity, much more difficult to be benefited from by residents because of their or its embeddedness in other types of gray infrastructure, because of its proximity to poor housing. And even when even when public governments have tried to bring nature back into the city, they have also done it in ways where residents are still exposed to other poor health markers. We've also seen that in the United States, in the case of New Orleans, for example, where we also have cycles of environmental equity then being undermined by new inequalities in greening, and nowadays also being somehow morphed into a different green privilege. In this neighborhood of Tremé, an African-American neighborhood in the center of New Orleans, African-American residents used to have access on Claiborne Avenue to this beautiful strolling place that then became I-10, a highway that scarred the neighborhood, that divided the neighborhood in half, created huge environmental contamination, and is now being envisioned into a new future greenway that is also being seen in the views of residents as a place that will bring gentrification, that will bring the creative class and a new type of investment for which that is not directed towards them in particular. And so in that sense, what we see is that planning faces what James calls a green paradox, the fact that environmental privilege and the continuation of that privilege and urban growth, spatial and economic growth, are codependent and prevent greater justice in the green city. And so despite the fact that we see in all of these varieties of cities needs for urban greening, despite the multiple co-benefits that greening brings, green infrastructure can recreate or create a green Lulu in racially mixed and working class neighborhood. What do we mean by a green Lulu? It's a word that comes from a planning, from the planning field, which is generally seen as a toxic site, a waste site, a refinery, a highway, next former factory and broader industrial complex that has been left abandoned. So this type of brown and gray facilities that residents necessarily associate with being undesirable in their neighborhood. And here the hypothesis is that greening can become itself a locally unwanted land use because of the types of inequalities it produces and reproduces over time. So, of course, the main thematic lens through which we look at the most current type of greening and inequalities within greening is environmental gentrification. The fact that the creation of green space, green infrastructure in a defined period will over time contribute in the presence of other, let's say, control variables to gentrification, that is, to the displacement or the exclusion of the most vulnerable population, economically or racially. And this within a broader environmental ethic that Sarah Dooling talks about when she coined the term, but what we also see within a broader urban green boosterism practice that I'll talk about very briefly afterwards. And then, within this literature on green or climate, green or environmental gentrification, you have the broader, let's say, connections with climate change. Thus, there's also a term that we explore very much in the book, which is the climate gentrification aspect of urban greening, meaning that green resilient infrastructure, our hypothesis is that it is not meant to address all the social and ecological vulnerabilities of neighborhood, but over time, or maybe it is meant to do that, but over time, it will also contribute to the physical and the social displacement of socially vulnerable residents. So another theme that we work with in the book is related to urban green branding. The brand that greening brings to cities in their search for competition, for investment, for becoming an identity that will then create greater arrival of creative class residents, different types of events, different types of financial benefits and revenues that can, of course, also booster other roles. And so what we've seen in our research is that high levels of urban green boosterism are strongly associated with high levels of unaffordability, meaning that there's a very tight relationship between cities that have a very strong and very long green brand and their inability to support the living conditions of working class residents who would be accessing that green city. In an article that complements a little bit that idea of return on investment of the green city, we're also looking at the green grabbing logic, the way in which urban greening is not a cost, it is on the contrary a rent upon which investors and developers are capitalizing in many different ways to then market their own product, increase the price of their own product, access financing in easier way, by then bringing the upper price sometimes of their own greening investment onto customers, clients, renters, etc. So there is this sense that there is an elite capture of the benefits of urban greening in a very privatized and in a very capital investment manner. What we also see, and I talk a little bit about this, and we bring that through the book, more or less, depending on the chapters, is the fact that greening is also a social spatial practice of white supremacy, which includes land grabbing practices by green projects themselves, but also over time, the exclusion and coercion of non-white practices, meaning that in a particular space that has become green or in a neighborhood that has become green, more invisible, more informal, more racialized practices of recreation, of physical activity, of meeting in that place are becoming, let's say, less desirable. Now we'll let James walk us through the book.
Thank you, Isabelle. And yeah, I'll share my screen quickly. Sorry for the transition here. So Isabelle has just framed basically the conceptual frame for the book and some of the conceptual trends that come up throughout the book. But as she mentioned, it has been a large project that involved bringing together many authors across many case studies, all of which are based upon fieldwork done by at least one member of our lab. that went to cities and really focused on at least one neighborhood within those cities to try to understand primarily how people on the ground, residents, people organizing around greening, policymakers and developers, how they're understanding the relationship between greening, social change, built form change in their cities, in their neighborhoods. And we more or less just sort of wanted to ask that question of how are these dynamics being perceived by people living in cities in North America and Europe. And so we developed a set of cities that became our sort of case study cities that we would look at. And what we did is then analyze and think through some of the trends that we were hearing from people's perceptions in cities and organize them into sections. And so the book has several sections that go through the different, maybe you would call it the different manifestations of the relationship between greening and social injustice that we see, the different kind of drivers that we see in these cities. So the first part of the book is called The Social Costs of Glitzy Green Urbanism. And this refers to what is perhaps the easiest to conceptualize way that greening and social injustice become intertwined. And that is that when green interventions are these high profile, very, very visible, very sort of agenda setting items in the city, then they have high impact on social change and on changes in the city. So we look here at Milan, Valencia, Amsterdam, and Bristol, particularly turning toward European cases to try to show that this conversation is especially vibrant in both. And you can find plenty of North American cases as well, but especially vibrant in both Europe and North America. And this mode of greening is one that we see at least in some form in many of the cases that we're looking at. So that relationship between sort of a glitzy form of green urbanism and social injustice is one way that we express this relationship. But in part two, we turn toward a slightly different pathway that we call compounded risks and impacts of urban greening in post-industrial environments. And so here we're looking at Dallas, Glasgow, San Francisco, Seattle, and Cleveland. And these are cities pictured here that have a strong formerly industrial identity and still have large areas that have formerly industrial land that is being cleaned up, being transformed, neighboring to residential communities. And these are cities that have maybe what you would classify a little bit more as classic environmental justice issues and concerns that are being dealt with. And in these cities, we're very much focused on the way that the environmental risk is being shifted and transformed and replaced in the city, and who's affected by that shift, who gets the benefits of reduced risk in their environment, and who sort of ends up losing out in the end. And that's another pathway that we see as a common one within the cities that we're looking at. And then in part three, we turn to still a different pathway through which this relationship takes shape, and we call it recreating unjust racialized landscapes in the Green City. And not coincidentally, all of these cities are North American, and this is very much focused on the racialization of space in cities. And we look here at Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Austin, and Boston. Those cities are pictured here. And these are particularly cities where land use is highly characterized by racial segregation, and we draw upon that history to talk about how greening is both reshaping and reinforcing that history within the city, and what that looks like and what that feels like to people that are living in the cities. And then in another slightly related pathway, we look in part four at what we call the complex entanglement of greening and multiple other gentrification pressures. And here the conversation gets a little bit complex because these are cities, Dublin, Montreal, Philadelphia, Barcelona, pictured here, where there are massive social changes happening. Some of them have impacts on social justice and social injustice, social inequities that we might draw upon in these cities. And greening is one of the things that's going on. Greening is one of the elements of change, one of the kind of tools that these cities are using as they try to shape this process of change that's happening. But there's also lots of other things, lots of other very important elements of what's happening. And so greening can't really be parsed out that easily from, for example, in Barcelona, from the massive tourism infrastructure that's put in place in the city, or transit investments and things of that sort that are very central and very, very high profile in these cities. And so we talk about what that means and looks like in these cities, where greening is sort of a complicated mix of things that are interventions that are happening in these cities. And then finally, in section 5, we try to point toward more hopeful cases, areas where we can find evidence that there is reason to think that we have models for urban greening that cannot necessarily result in a social injustice outcome, but rather can take us in the opposite direction. And so it's not as if Copenhagen, Nantes, Vienna, and Portland give us the kind of the silver bullet, as you might say, that give us the one answer for how to come up with a just urban green policy. But rather they give us different elements that might come together and might start to influence and inform our thinking in terms of what a just urban green model looks like. And so these are those cities. But just to give you a sense, certainly those in Vienna know quite well the context there. But Vienna has its own very specific context, which gives other cities things to think about. A long history of decommodification of housing, which others know much more about than myself. But that's an influence that we might take from the Vienna's greening strategy and how that history incorporates into its greening strategy. And turning to the US, we might look at cities where there's long histories of organizing, especially around communities of color, around greening initiatives. And some of that organizing is a way of really linking the greening to community agendas and community initiatives in a way that has a slightly different effect in those cities. And so we look at those kinds of trends and try to think about how they might come together to give us a better, bigger picture of greening and justice. And then for the rest of the talk, we wanted to just give a little bit of a very quick taste of what some of these chapters look like. But Isabelle, in the name of time, I'm going to move very quickly through San Francisco, just sort of hitting the one highlight, and then turn it over to you to close it out. I'm just cognizant of, I'm eager to hear Dagmar's conversation as well, so I don't want to cut that off either. But Isabelle and I are just going to give a quick sort of taste of what 2 of these chapters contain, and then close out the conclusion discussion of the book. So I was lead author on a few chapters, but the one was looking at San Francisco Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood, which is closest to us in this image and is near to downtown San Francisco. And just to cut to the chase, Bayview Hunters Point is one of the last remaining neighborhoods in San Francisco that still has a concentrated Black and African-American population. And there used to be many communities in the city that could say that, but that is no longer the case due to gentrification processes, which are quite intense in the city. These are scenes from a recent film called The Last Black Man in San Francisco, which is a riff on this notion. Bayview Hunters Point has seen lots of recent investment in both transit and in environmental cleanup. It is a very, very heavily industrial area historically where they built atomic bombs. So there were very, very heavy industry happening here. But the takeaway from this chapter and what this chapter really focuses on is the fact that there are massive new greening initiatives meant to make the community both more climate resilient and healthier in the bigger picture sense. But it's also seen as the last frontier of gentrification and displacement in the city. And these 2 things are not coincidental in the minds of residents that have been advocating for green initiatives for many decades and not successfully. So this quote here is really the takeaway from the chapter, which is that one resident says, everyone is trying to stabilize housing. If you don't have a place to stay, you don't care that the sea level is going to rise. You don't care that the air is bad. You don't care about the quality of the environment. And this is from a longtime organizer who has been organizing for environmental initiatives in the neighborhood for many decades. And so basically it's a focus on how when residents are faced with this necessary trade-off between I can either keep advocating for a healthier environment or I can focus on stabilization of my neighborhood. When they're forced to make that decision, what happens? And that's what this chapter really focuses on. And so Isabelle, I'll turn it over to you at this point. And if you want to just discuss your chapter and close it off. You're still muted as well.
Am I still muted? Am I still muted or not? No, I think I'm okay.
No, you're good. Everything's, yeah, we're seeing your full presentation.
I'm sorry, everyone. Okay, finally. All right. So the chapter that I would like to talk a bit more about is Dublin, which is a space where I did some of my field work. And the idea here is to show the way in which greening is entangled with a type of gentrification that is both student-driven and tech industry-driven. And so the title of the chapter was Environmental Inequalities in Fast-Growing Dublin, Combined Scarcity of Green Space and Affordable Housing for the Liberties. The Liberties is historically a white Irish working class neighborhood close to Temple Bar, so very much in the center of the city. And it has had a very strong historical dearth of green space, the least amount of green areas in Ireland, as well as numerous empty and derelict spaces that come from a history of post-industrial landscapes, let's say. And what we see at the moment is that a push for greening the liberties is embedded into a broader housing crisis and international tech and student-driven real estate speculation and gentrification. And so the way to think about it is that Dublin, and in particular that area of Dublin, is living through very rapid yearly price increases in rental and for sale properties at the same time as growing homelessness, especially of single moms and their children. And so when in 2015, the Dublin City Council came together to try to really address greening, the lack of greening in the liberties, the idea was to associate a variety of small scale and large scale green infrastructure in different parts of the neighborhood, as well as green streets. And so one of the examples of something that did really well was the construction of Weaver Park, which is a very multi-generational, multi-use park in the center of the neighborhood. And that was very much conceived by, driven by, and designed by residents. However, it is also interesting to see how that very manicured green space doesn't actually leave space and right to adjacent community gardens that got removed in the process of constructing the park, and that are now rebuilt into what's called rapid social housing, which means lower income and low cost housing in a neighborhood actually that has, again, this very large presence of empty homes. Another large green space built in the neighborhood, which is about to be finished, is Breadfoot Street Park, which, as you can see also on the left part of the picture, is adjacent to this large-scale housing development, which is a luxury student housing. And so interviewing the managers of the building was really interesting because it was very much around what I was saying earlier, which is we are now able to market our unit, to showcase the value of our property through this new greening that will benefit the users of that space. And so what we see in Dublin is that the greening strategy are legitimizing and helping to market high-end student housing. And what's particularly interesting in those student housing is that they are all led by global investor, global groups coming from the UK, from Australia, who have decided to have a student real estate portfolio because of their ability to literally cram in more residents and charge more for smaller and less livable spaces. They are not meant, or let's say such spaces don't have to have as many windows, as many balconies, or as traditional residential homes. They can also be converted in the summer into short-term rental. So there is this maximization of profit by student, or let's say by student income and by tourists through the construction of those student residences. And the difficulty of Dublin is that for many, many years, there haven't been strong housing rights mobilizations. Other political issues, as you can imagine, around identity, national identity politics, really took precedent. And so the housing movement that was strong actually in the 1960s and 70s became very, very scattered and became very unimpactful in its ability to mobilize greater support and have a role in institutional politics. So to just quote one city councillor who is very supportive of social justice in Dublin, the greening strategy was to make it look like this is a good area for you to invest in. Build your student accommodation here because next door you're going to get a park. You're going to get a nice tourist trial. We're going to clean up the mess, but nothing for the residents. What we also see is how greening is privatized and gated in the context of also neoliberalized green space, meaning that there's not very much money that the city council is dedicating to building public green space. A lot of these green space is being built by developers. They're getting their permit under the guarantee that they will have open space next to their facilities, and then they gate that space, as you can see on that picture. And then in the meantime, many areas of the liberties remain with unabated pollution and post-industrial landscapes. So the question here is, are we seeing a dichotomous greenish neighborhood with limited housing organizing impact, or can the liberties become a more green and just space for working class residents? So just to finish and pass on the example of Nantes so that we don't spend too much time, can we build a new tale for the green city? And our push here is that, yes, it is feasible, but via a very strong anti-subordination, intersectional and relational mode of urban greening, meaning that we need to think beyond justice as distribution, justice as recognition, or justice as participation, but really think about the intersectional climate, environmental, health, and social inequalities that residents of working class, of racialized neighborhoods are living through. We need to think about their relational values and identities in a space, in a green space, but also within the entire neighborhood. And we need to think about how greening, because of its relationship with land and land rights, can also be much more emancipatory, can really address long-term segregation and exclusion dynamics. From a policy and planning standpoint, and that's also a little bit of the message that we have in our final chapter, we believe in the right, we believe that an answer towards planning for green justice is finding the right mix of both anti-displacement and equitable and inclusive green development tools. So we have a side report to the book that we published 11 months ago that looks at 50 of those different tools that are land use tools, that are tax incentives, that are taxation period, and that are aimed at different groups. And so we compare a little bit the way they've been used in a variety of cities and their potential for urban green justice. So yes, to conclude, urban greening and green spaces are vital to climate, ecological, and human health. We do not deny that, and we support, obviously, these important objectives. However, achieving equity in greening requires questioning the exclusion embedded in the green city orthodoxy. In racialized contexts in particular, we must consider the deep segregationist and exclusionary legacies of racial settlement and decolonize the green city. So moving beyond, in a way, the glossiness, the aesthetics of the green city, to think more deeply about land recognition, redistribution, and reparations to groups that also have left the city as a trauma and as a separation. And I know that Dagmar has worked on that, so her work has also been very inspiring there. If you are interested in the book, but do find that you'd like to engage in a different way in our case studies, we have a documentary with 6 cities that is already partially released, and that brings in interviews with some of our respondents, some of the community groups we've been working with in Portland, Oregon, Washington, Boston, Montreal, Nantes, and Barcelona. We also have a documentary that's focused much more specifically on 4 neighborhoods of Barcelona, to green or not to green. And finally, we've tried to use so much of our quantitative and spatial data around urban green space since 1990 and gentrification trends since that time to build ArcGIS story maps, looking, helping the reader also see the intersection between those two dynamics. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Isabelle and James, for your thought-provoking presentation. I highly enjoyed it and appreciated it. I would immediately leave the floor to Dagmar for her comments and questions to kick off the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, to Isabelle and to James, but also to Yuri for his nice introduction. So yeah, I have to say I read the book with a lot of pleasure, and also I know not most, but I would say half of the places and cities that they report about in this book, and this interesting point here is that this knowledge from the places it is over a quite long period of time. So the first places I got to know some, I don't know, 15-20 years ago, and some I visited recently before Corona started to shape our life a bit and turned me into a home office person. Well, but I also want to say that it was nice in the presentation to see some of the excellent photographs now in color. I think you really put what you wrote and what the authors of this great book wrote into very self-speaking photographs. This is what I like very much. So I can also advise the book not only to pure scientists, but also to somebody who wants to really read an interesting story, and because it's a nice, very nice language. So it's really a reader and something you can just take for your holidays as well, not only as an academic textbook, I would say. This was what I liked a lot. And I think it touches an issue which is much more than green gentrification or socio-environmental injustice. It is at least a facet of what we see in our urban life. And I think when you just widen this a bit, Isabelle and James talked about it, to the urban health sector, the public health sector, you could just run the similar story. Maybe you can just use the similar places and spaces, the neighborhoods you have shown, and focusing more on this health injustice. And interestingly, this morning I got an article from a colleague of mine about more the health question of cities, and they just mentioned in the first pages what our two editors of the book just mentioned, that we have really an impact in poor, marginalized and low green neighborhoods. They just people, live 10 years shorter than their neighbors in more affluent neighborhoods. And I mean, 10 years, even if we get comparatively old now, 10 years is an issue. And when you then suffer from let's say a chronic disease, then even the years before might not be that the best compared to greener neighborhoods and to those who can afford to go to green neighborhoods. And now I come to my second point here is what I found fascinating, and I also found it fascinating when we were composing an article with colleagues from the part of Europe the book doesn't tell about, because you cannot tell about everything. The Eastern European part, I collaborated with colleagues from Romania, so hard to say, from Russia, from Ukraine, from Belarus, from Poland, and from Hungary and Eastern Germany. So we're also part of Eastern Europe, at least in our understanding, because we share these socialist legacies and path dependencies. And then, when I compare this, I have to say that we wrote about even more drastic stories, particularly in Romania and Hungary, when it's about environmental and health injustices of minorities. They are very close to what you have in the book about the US. And here I think it would be simply great if we could find a span over this different. I would say also that the periods are different. So in the Western part of the world, it started much more early. At least they talked about this earlier. In the socialist times, I went to school at least when I was a child in a socialist school. And of course, there was no gentrification. And in my hometown, Leipzig, they didn't see gentrification for a long time because this couldn't be the case, but actually it was. And insofar, I think this is a super start with the tales. And I think it is would be so nice just to add some more tales and maybe to publish. James, Isabelle, I look at you in 5-10 years. The second chapter, the second part of the book, saying some new tales, what we have learned, what is new here. So this is really, I appreciate it a lot, this tale character. And my next comment is more because I started as I am an ecologist, even if I also write about justice and green gentrification issues. And this is sometimes for an ecologist a difficult topic because we mainly talk about the buzzword green. Some lawns you have seen, right? Some trees, some hedgerows. But of course, when we say, and this could be, or for me, it is an answer, let's say so, on this very difficult question, how to make it better, how to avoid what seems to be something like natural in our cities, that some smaller groups win and the rest is somehow losing. And I think, of course, we can employ nature as exactly as it is done in super neighborhoods, super cool parks, at best with exotic species you don't want to see in our parks, but they are there. Maybe they are better adapted. I don't want to question that, but it's just possible to plant local species and native species. But I mean, there's also super interesting nature at brownfields, at some sites you have shown in the photographs. And I think when we take this ecological aspect a bit more serious, saying nature has also a right, as all people in the city. And there is maybe a certain kind of way to interact with a native nature species, whatever. There is small nature experiences. You can do it as I said, at the edge of a brownfield if you want. There are often little kids groups where I live very close, and I said in Corona times it was just to turn around this brownfield 2 times, 3 times a day, and you saw a lot of kids groups, and they just were looking at the butterfly there, at different small pollinators, bees, yeah, dragonflies. And this is so rich. This is a very important kind of a richness of a city. And I think you can't see this in super performed glitzy, I love this word when I listen at the glitzy environments of these green towers and other gardens, some fenced green spaces we also have here in our city, and in Berlin, many more. We have just fenced streets now. So, but I think you need to recognize this. And this is not expensive, but it must stay, it must remain. So it cannot be pushed away because another housing estate, a high cost housing estate, will be built. And this is I think it's really a question of recognition. And you find these places, these tiny green spaces everywhere. Yeah, but it's not so easy to find them. So as an ecologist, I would love to have a stronger part of nature to help human and vice versa. I think they can do a nice collaboration here. Well, so maybe so far to the book, and my last sentence about this is, it is so worth reading. I loved it really. I already recommended it to some students of our environmental justice course, yeah, I think it should be definitely a base for common courses in urban design, also for urban landscape architects. For the architects, it is really important because they often ignore a little bit diversity, but much more the social question. And here I think it would be very worth to give them this volume at hand. So, and now I have some questions. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask them, our 2 editors. Yeah, Good.
Yes, please.
Super. I think it was Isabelle who touched the question, how long do we already have this green gentrification? I mean, I think you can discuss about green gentrification years, right? And you will never find a common answer of all the different experts. But when you looked at your cases and the many stories you reported, is there something else at a point in time or a certain period in urban development where you would say, oh, this is so something like the origin, or where it really come apparent, this green gentrification? Or is it a very, very, already ancient thing, but we didn't name it gentrification? This would be, I have no answer on this question, to be honest.
I think both James and I can respond from our different perspective. I mean, I think the word, green gentrification, or first of all, the word gentrification appeared in the 60s. And so it's a phenomenon that people consider more recent, but of course, cases of urban renewal and evictions of the working class to make space for different types of infrastructure, gray and green, like you take Central Park. I think James can talk much better than me about it. It's not a new phenomenon, right? We didn't call it gentrification, but it's definitely a green privilege construction. Now, in relationship to, let's say, the most recent times, I think that when Sarah Dooling and others, like around almost like 15 years ago, started talking about it, I think it was out of a consideration that greening the city started as a more social and very, responding to local Agenda 21s and other types of goals that had well-being and social cohesion and equitable access to public equipment in mind, to then really becoming part of the competitive city and being associated with awards, with prizes. Like you can also see that very much in a case like Vittoria Gasteiz, our colleagues in the lab, Julia Neidish, her PhD research is about that, like how at first mayors pushed in the 90s and in the beginning of the 2000s for greening, thinking very much about the health needs and about citizens really, and residents as citizens and residents as deserving a good quality of life, to then be like, actually, I can make a profit out of it. It's not something that is an expense for me. There can be a return on investment. And by the way, it can also attract international investment. And by the way, it can attract me prizes that then give me legitimacy for other policies. And so that's really interesting. And what Julia also shows on her research is how greening at the beginning was also a very politically easy agenda in conflict situations. And that was really interesting, I think, in her research in Vittoria Gasteiz.
Yeah, and very interesting. James, I don't know whether you want to give your...
I won't belabor the point. I'll just I agree with everything Isabelle said. The only sort of layer I would add is just that I think that the phenomenon of green gentrification does have its own character. It has a new character since the 1990s, when we have the kind of global sustainability shift and cities started to try to figure out how to be the mechanisms for realizing those goals. And particularly then developers try to figure out how to integrate into those goals and how to kind of leverage them in some ways. And then there was a kind of relationship that happened where cities started to say, well, some of that private investment capital can then be brought in to our processes and leveraged for greening initiatives. And we see a lot of that, a lot of kind of, we're going to leverage the increased tax revenue or the increased investment capital or the increased revenue of various sorts as a way of funding these green initiatives. And that's fairly new. But it does come back to the point you made, Dagmar, which I just wanted to really highlight as very important, which is that people's health, this is about people's health on some base level, and that greening and urban ecology has an impact on health. But in the end, people are, in the San Francisco case, people become skeptical of green initiatives for these reasons, right? So they start to say, well, that's not greening for me. And so I'm aware of the health implications, but my more immediate risk is being displaced from my neighborhood or being kind of pushed out of the city culturally. And so I'm willing to trade off, those long-term health implications or those long-term pictures for this short-term risk that I'm facing of displacement. So the only point I would make is that I truly believe that to the extent that urban ecologists and those who are furthering an urban ecological goal can acknowledge that upfront and say, yes, there are social justice implications here, and we want to acknowledge that and bring that into as part of the ecology discussion, which I think is what you were saying.
Yes,
precisely. I think that helps the ecological agenda, right? That strengthens it rather than the opposite, which is what's happening now.
But it's true, James, and I think this was one of the points I just noted in the conclusion part of your book. Because we as ecologists, I think we somehow contribute a bit to, let's say, maybe we support a bit those people looking for making a good investment and looking where the best place is when we have these green point tools, which are so super famous. You can simply use it for GIS. This is a super student work. You can map in the fields and then you just add your points. And of course, we make it public, right? We have publications, we have books, this is sometimes in the plans of the city. And of course, it is quite easy to see then these qualities. And of course, to say, we just do it for everybody. And there's no tension and no kind of notion in it, as it's naive. But I have to say, in the ecological community, we have a lot of this naivism about the social consequences. Still, it is just improving, but still it's a fact. And everybody has to know it. No, it's a bit different, but it's very hard to discuss this in the part of the, among the ecologists in my community. Well, but there's something else, what I think is interesting. And I think you said it, James, in the last story, where I say they try to hinder greening because they fear the impacts that will just come some years later. And I think we see this everywhere. At the beginning, at least in my hometown, when gentrification was not, where people were not aware about green gentrification, they were happy that the neighborhood, old railway area was just transformed into a super park. And what we have now is the first gentrified area in Leipzig, so the most gentrified. And this is now going on. And then this bigger park is part of a green kind of, way, a green arrow, so to say. And now people start to counteract, because they don't want to have the rest of this green circle way, so to say, because they experience what happened with the first part. And here comes my question, because when I think about myself and the planners, we are talking about this greening, I think somehow we are very much in this community who is more or less either preparing or also benefiting if you have a good job. I mean, a lot of my colleagues and friends, they just live in these areas that are green and gentrified, and they have the knowledge to make a decision to identify where to live, and then they have the money to make it happen. And my question is, but I have no answer on, whether when staying within our group and trying the very best, being socially motivated, can we really do it, or do we need to broaden the groups of who are planning, also acknowledging other wishes, other ideas than ours, which might lead to different green and whatever, to make it happen, that we have more participation, different participation? Or can we do this as a educated, I wouldn't say exclusively, but still mostly white community? Can we do this?
Isabelle, I'm very curious to hear your response here. I mean, it's certainly a question that I think, well, I'll just personalize it. I certainly think about it on my own personal level. And on one level, there's the pessimistic answer, which is, no. I mean, we can't step outside of that system, right? We don't have the option of stepping outside of the system that generates the kinds of inequalities in our cities that we live with. However, there is the other answer, which I think you were pointing to, Dagmar, which is that when we hear from people living in the communities that you pointed to in Leipzig, or in the communities I was pointing to in San Francisco, and they're saying, no, we don't want you to plant trees in our community. No, we don't want you to extend that greenway in our community, because we know what that has signaled in other communities. When we hear that, I think that we can't undo the system of investment that changes these communities in inequitable fashions, but we can take that seriously and say, okay, you're saying you don't want these trees or greenways for a very serious reason. It's not that you're just sort of dismissive of these things, or even it's usually people that have been supporting these kinds of initiatives for many years and suddenly say, no more, we don't want it anymore. We see what it's attached to. And when I think what we can do is what I think you were signaling, which is take that concern extremely seriously in the greening agenda and not say, okay, what we need to do is figure out ways to get past this and just plant trees anyway, or get past this and just extend the greenway anyway. What we need to do is think about how greening needs to change in that circumstance, right? If that is the circumstance, how does the green agenda need to change? And not focus so much on, well, we have this opportunity because there's money and interest and investment in extending the greenway, so let's just do it. Let's just push it through. That's, I think, the wrong agenda to take. And it's the one that will ultimately hurt the ecological agenda in the long run, I think. But I don't know, Isabelle, what do you think there?
No, I think it's a super difficult question. I think what we see is that when residents are most either dismissive or scared about greening, is that when they see that ecology or architecture tends to dominate, while housing, remains last. And so in the projects now that seem to be a bit more progressive, at least in their ability to put a brake on very rapid gentrification, we see that housing tends to be or equitable development tends to be very closely associated at the very beginning of the planning of the project. So an example I didn't talk about, which is Connolly in Portland or Anacostia in Washington, DC. Those are two places where equitable development planning has been put in place. Right to return policies for gentrified residents exist so that there is at least a certain number of residents who can stay. The problem, of course, is that in the US, everything is extreme. And so in the sense that, the role of developers in financial, in the revenues, in the budget of the city is huge because of the role of property tax. So developers will always have a much greater role in the US than they have in our American cities. But we see that in those two cases where there is, again, this word that equity is intentional, that justification is not as rapid. And there are two things that are put in place, either types of community land trust or all types of transfer taxes or density bonus taxes or inclusionary zoning mechanism that are a bit more stringent, like maybe 20%, 25% of all housing will be social or public. But we also see very strong, and that's, I think, much better done than I would say in Europe, anti-poverty strategies, meaning that not displacing people of color doesn't mean that they will secure their ability to raise a family, to live well in that neighborhood. And so they often associate greening as part of the social and solidarity economy, as part of cooperative work led by minorities that then have these new types of business plans in which they can develop their own ventures so that greening becomes a community and individual, let's say, wealth. And I say wealth in an honorable way. I'm not talking about capitalist wealth here. So I think that's really important in some ways. And the other aspect is really about, how James was talking about it, and you too, like, how is green planned? How is it marketed? When are people intervening in the process of greening? And
Yeah.
And the role that can also be placed to informal greening, right? Invisible greening, exactly what you were talking about during the pandemic.
Exactly. Exactly. Cool. No, thank you. Yeah, this is a question we're always asking in our environmental justice classes. So, and very often we just bring examples, but we moved around in a bit more generalized answer on that. So I will just keep in mind what you said for the next seminar. And I have just one last issue I observed in several projects about several different concerns. One example was the flood and who was affected by a flood and who not in a city, but also who can access or comes actually to a green space and who not, and also other experience during a heat wave. And what I was seeing there, that we have at least I observed an age specific, let's say, visitation or risk or suffering from a certain risk. And my question is, when I don't know whether you have this analyzed in your quantitative part, which is not part of the book, in this quantitative data, what you referred to, Isabelle, in the GIS stories. Is there an age-specific aspect of this green gentrification or not? That means, yeah, certain groups are more so, yeah, benefiting from or suffering from not.
I think we haven't looked at that as much, which is, I think there are two aspects we didn't look at: gender and age.
Okay.
And
okay.
what we talked about earlier, which I think is really, really important, which is the right of nature and non-humans. And so in that sense, we didn't look at that. I would say, actually, interesting. No, I'm gonna, I think in one aspect, it didn't come as much as the book, but it's part of an article that James and I wrote together. In some cities, age is definitely a marker of vulnerability. And so in Barcelona, for example, we have identified residents who are over 65 and living alone as part of the residents who should be included into our gentrification index, if those are gentrified out of the city. In other cases, elderly residents, actually those with greater financial power because of their retirement that has accrued and accumulated. So I think age is also interesting depending on where you're talking about. And then of course, age and design, age appropriate, age sensitive green space design is super important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I mean, we all know the elderly can't walk for a long distance, but they need every day light and green, right, for just keeping healthy. And insofar, yes, this could be an interesting point just to widen this a bit, this debate on justice aspects. And when I think about this, there was an interesting project. Actually, I sometimes I come to Yuri, you know it, WWTF. This is a funding of Vienna, and they have always every 5 years a panel. And I'm part of this panel, at least was 3 times or so. And there was a super interesting project about vertical segregation and injustice. And I was thinking about several kinds of house forms, this kind of, who's suffering then? Maybe you live at the same place at the same coordinates, but it depends on where you live to benefit from different parts of, let's say, first floor, second floor nature, as we call it in ecology. Yeah, great. So there are many, many things to study, and I'm ready with my questions and my little interview.
Thanks a lot
thank
for
you.
your contribution. James, you want to, yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you, Dagmar, for the very thoughtful questions and the comments on the book.
Wonderful. We can open up now the discussion to the broader audience. We would be very happy to welcome any written or also oral question, comment on what has been just presented and discussed upon. So you can raise your hand or write the question in the chat box, as you prefer. So even shy people might be able to ask questions, let's say. While we're waiting, I have also a few comments, and okay, good. Thanks a lot for, yes, you can keep up with what is posted in the chat box. There are a few interesting links there. I have a few comments also on the book. I like it very much and think it shows complexity in a simple way. And it's not just a set of case studies piled up there, but it's also grouped in an analytical framework, which makes the book a really value added, which is not so to be taken for granted, I would say. It shows also the complexity. So you speak about entangled gentrification, the need to have a relational, intersectional perspective on the whole process, which is taking place. And I think that's absolutely the best way to understand how the different dynamics going on, the drivers interact with the context, with the power relation, with the physical environment, etc., and produce very context-specific output. My question would be, how can you account for differences? So, and how differences make a difference, and which differences make a real differences in influencing, driving specific contexts to have a certain type of outcome. So you mentioned already that partly when you spoke about the Vienna case and a few other aspects. So the green, what was your wording? I don't remember exactly. The victory of the green, etc. So, but is it the public which is able to intervene? What role does the market play? Investors? Are these green conflicts, which is more James, I would say, how are these able to tell us, okay, look, this should go in that direction. It should be the public hand which should take control over the process. Otherwise, the market will always produce a specific output, or I don't know. How can you combine these elements and tell us something about which would be your priority out of this from an analytical point of view?
I see Isabelle delaying, so I'll jump in there first. Maybe I'll begin with one thought, and then see if this sort of can be a bit of a discussion. Yuri, maybe you can sort of prompt it a little bit more. But the question of difference and how do we account for difference in the cases and sort of what that difference means. It's a question that for me became far more central to my work when I moved from the US to Europe, to Barcelona, and the process of accounting for difference in those two contexts became very central. And then as we expanded our work into looking at Western Europe and wider in North America, that became, I would say, a regular conversation amongst us as this project developed. And it was sort of along the lines of trying to balance between what is the same and what is different, or trying to, maybe not balance is the right word, but trying to account for what is the same and what is different, and what that means. And so on one hand, we lean a lot on things that are the same, which is that there are similar, say, to very simple, to put it in simple terms, similar global investment market pressures, similar urban competitive dynamics happening in all of these cases, similar sort of language and frames of reference for the green agenda in the city, similar ways of gaining recognition within that agenda. These things were all similar and could be quite comparable in all the cases, I think. But then, for example, you raised the Vienna case, and another member of our lab did the fieldwork there, Carmen Pulgar, and very much she raised this notion. Well, Vienna's got a different starting point. Vienna's sort of a different context and a different way of thinking about even just the question of gentrification, let alone the question of greening and gentrification. And I think it comes very much from conversations with you, Yuri, and people working with you to understand that difference. And so we we tried to then say, okay, yeah, you're right. There is this sort of point where you have to say, now there's a point of departure in this case where, the sameness has to be kind of left on one side and the difference has to be fully accounted for. And living in Barcelona, that also became quite central, because Barcelona, we got a lot of feedback from people in Barcelona saying, well, there's this very specific context in terms of the global tourism pressures and the very specific political context of Barcelona that shaped some of the dynamics we're looking at as well. And so I think in the end, that led us to these different components of the book, but also it led us to the notion that there are kind of two levels at which a green justice agenda needs to move, one of which works on this level of sameness of, trying to say, well, if you just keep using greening as a way of reinforcing these same trends, you're going to keep getting greening being attached to the same output, which is, just reflecting kind of global systems that are producing inequities in cities. But then there's another level of action here, which is more about addressing how it particularly looks in particular contexts. And here, I think we're looking, what we ended up doing is having to really narrow the number of cities that we're really focused on. And because of where we were, Barcelona became one of our big targets. And so we have lots of material about what specifically needs to happen in Barcelona, how specifically organizing works, what the specific role of the public sector might be in Barcelona, and then what some of the particular green injustices that are occurring in Barcelona from the Barcelona context look like. So that's a long-winded way of saying that we had this conversation internally over a long period of time, and what we arrived at is that there is sort of these two levels. There are these two levels that have to be kind of addressed simultaneously. And if you don't, if you leave off what's the same, then you're incomplete. You're sort of not addressing a very fundamental aspect. But if you don't address what's different, then it's not gonna fit for the city. I don't know, Isabelle, maybe I'm just rambling here. So maybe if you want to jump in.
Oh, that's a perfect answer, I would say. I fully agree with you, but you need to recognize the overall trends which are taking place in many cities, in many countries all over the world. But at the same time, they are embedded in context which modify the impact, which shape the drivers, which, I don't know, gentrification in Vienna is definitely very different from gentrification in New York, in Brooklyn, or wherever. And there is a reason behind that. And these reasons are what we are interested in, understanding similarities and differences. So nobody denies that gentrification is taking place in Vienna. But maybe here it is lower, maybe the impact of displacement is not that harsh as in countries where evictions are not so protected, or so where the people are not protected against evictions, etc., etc. So there are a lot of elements which help us qualify. And I think the book provides a lot of interesting examples on these aspects, which play an important role. So thanks a lot.
I think it was also really, maybe I'm not answering your question because I think it's a very complex question, and I don't have the skills right now to just dissect it to its to give it justice. But I think what was also interesting and also kind of sad in some of our cases is that places that started different because they had a greater social strata, they had of support, of welfare system, of housing rights, still kind of end up in the same trajectory. Maybe they are not exactly, where Austin is or where Boston is in terms of the green inequalities, but they're also somehow getting there. So if you take a place like Nantes, for example, it started as a place that had both equity and equality goals in greening very much in a post-industrial city landscape, to maybe now being this place where the head of the green space department, which has a huge proportion of the city budget, 13%, tells you that they are moving towards the museification of green. Green being a spectacle, a show. And so when you ask a bit more about the details, yeah, we want to have Japanese tourists come here. We want to be a model in Europe. We want to metropolize Nantes. And so that city that started as a small regional place of well-being and attractiveness for people who don't have as many means, but wanted to live in a nice little town where the mayor was very socially oriented, now is becoming a global metropolis. We've seen the same in Copenhagen, the green city that had a lot of housing cooperatives and housing rights, that now has a green resilient district, Nørrebro, which is where gentrification is taking place the most through the city, and where there is this very anti-immigrant discourse associated with it. So it's kind of sad in that sense, even in our section that has the greatest hope about the just green city, we see the similar trends of neoliberalization of green and green inequalities.
That's absolutely true. Thanks a lot for your sad comment. So, any question in the meantime? Yes? Please, Patrick Picha,
Okay.
if I pronounce it correctly.
Picha.
Picha.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Picha is one of the most vulgar words in the Czech language, so be aware of the pronunciation.
Okay.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for your presentation and this opportunity. And when I was reading the chapter about Vienna, what was fascinating for me was how different the policies of the city are from the policies of national government. And I think that's a very interesting political dimension, and I would be interested if that's some specialty of Vienna, or if that's some like more general trend which you can see in other cities, that the policies regarding, for example, social policies and others are so different between cities and national governments that they have actually to clash against each other. And the second thing is that's maybe not a question, but a comment, that it would be very interesting to do this project in Eastern Europe, but because, I mean, for example, regarding Vienna, if I would propose so much regulation, for example, in Prague, or generally in the Czech Republic, many people and many politicians would just go crazy, call me communist, and maybe that's too simple, but yeah, actually it seems to me often the Czech Republic that in order to break from the communist past, we went from one extreme to another. Yeah.
Thank you for your great question. Isabelle, James?
No, I mean, I think our inability to look at Eastern Europe is pretty glaring, and the title doesn't fully represent, obviously, the reality and the need of research on the broader continent. I think, something that happens in a lot of those projects is our limited ability to engage with cultures, with understanding of urban development and of really policies and tools in a language that we don't have the abilities to engage with. And I think that was key for us, is to have researchers who could do the research firsthand, so that we really had the homogeneity of the fieldwork and the ability to also engage with local groups and institutions. And so I think that's definitely a weakness of the group, explained by what I just mentioned. In terms of the policies, I think what's interesting is that you have policies that try to imitate Vienna, but they are also so, cities, but they also start from such a delayed situation that their ability of those social policies to be faster in a way than gentrification and green gentrification is really questionable. And so Barcelona now has, support to housing co-ops, control of housing price for new rentals, a 30% obligation for every 100 units to be built, developers have to build 30 of them, so 30% affordable or public housing. And so you have different rules that bring us towards the direction of where places like Vienna are, but we start in a country where only 3% of our housing stock is social or public housing. And so good luck in that sense. You have places that are like Nantes, where for every 100 units to be built, 56 of them have to be social and public. And in a place that has already a very, very strong housing rights policy that is imposed at the national level, having such standards added or amplified at the local level strengthens the national policies and mitigates the green gentrification I was talking about, and displacement in particular. But James, you might have other perspectives.
I would just in a minute here say that, Patrick, I think you raised a dynamic that it has been raised in other contexts with environmental agendas, but it is present here very much, the multi-scalar politics that you point to in terms of conflicts between what a city level agenda might be pushing for and what a state or provincial or federal agenda might be pushing for. Those conflicts are very present in many of the cities we looked at as well. If you extend it over to North America, there's certainly a very big divide often between the politics at the city scale and the politics at the state that contains the city. And they're often in conflict, and you can see that in a lot of these cities for sure.
I think this multiscalar perspective is very fascinating because it shows that, as you rightly mentioned, it's complex. And this multiscalarity adds one layer of complexity because it channels resources, it channels regulation. And in some countries, regulation can take place at the national level, in some other countries at the federal state level. And Vienna, to continue on that example, is a Bundesland, which has some powers that other cities do not have. And they are able to channel some resources, regulate specific aspects that other cities are not able to. So this, let's say, the institutional architecture might play an important role in that whole dynamic, I would say. So, any other question or comment? Yes, please, Natalie Fink.
Yeah, hello. Sorry, I'll have to talk kind of quietly because I'm in the library, but just wanted to say, yeah, thanks again for the presentation, and I'm very interested to read more of you guys' book. I think something that really resonated with me is the fact that Portland was used as one of the examples of where, I guess, the greening of a city has gone successfully, because I'm from about 4 hours away from Portland. And I think that the mediated messages of Portland are quite negative as far as it comes to the gentrification and homelessness population there. And so I guess my question to you guys would be, how is the greening of the city more successful than, or like, what are some success points of the greening of the city? And I guess, how does one separate this from the still very large problem of homelessness that is happening within the city? Yeah.
No, sorry, I think you make a very important point about Portland, which is that the broader sustainability image via, the mobility policies of Portland and other related ones definitely have played a very strong role in gentrification. So that's not something we are denying. Interestingly enough, in our quantitative analysis that we did, Portland doesn't come as one of the cities where green, so really the green space, explains gentrification. And so we are no way hypothesizing that other sustainability variables are playing a role, but we don't have them in the model. I think that the reason why we chose Portland as one of the cases where greening can be just is because if you take it at the neighborhood level of Connolly, the type of really, really intensive, dedicated mobilization of Latinx groups is something very laudable that we wanted to highlight in a broader landscape where such mobilization either doesn't exist in other cities in North America, where it doesn't exist, it doesn't get the type of successful implementation that we've seen in Connolly. But I think that in general, you're absolutely right to point that out, that the city itself has gigantic homelessness issues and complete inequalities that are linked to the broader image of Portland as livable. So thank you for sure highlighting that. James, you are closer to Portland, so you probably have other insights?
No, I don't have any of that. I think it's a really perceptive observation that all of the cases in that section, they have we're highlighting one element, and then there's a lot of other elements that one could draw out that would give you a slightly different perception of the city, I think.
I mean, just in that same vein, I think that the way that you in your book approach this situation of like specifically inequality when it comes to green space, like for example, I'd never really been notified about the mobilization of Latinx communities in Portland. It's more so that I come from a more conservative part of the Pacific Northwest, and I think that there's these messages that you hear about Portland, it being like left-leaning, and also like I think the messages about the structure of the city is that it's going downhill, like it's always something you hear in the media. So I was actually really, really happy to see it framed in a positive light, and I'm definitely going to look into it more to have more things to talk to my relatives about next time I go home. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Anybody else with a question or a comment before we are closing? Yes, Natalie Terrell, please.
Yeah, hi, as well from me. Thank you for the presentation. It's super interesting. My interest is also in generally public places. And I was thinking of how green spaces provide public spaces for people where there's not really a focus on consumption. And like generally, I was just thinking that green spaces are more of a summertime thing, right? So I was wondering if there's also any focus on like greens. It might sound weird, but like green spaces during the winter, or is it then just like something that's very different of like public spaces in the winter that can't be green spaces? I don't know if that makes sense, but I was just kind of like wondering on that issue.
This is not exactly what you're asking about, but it kind of goes in the same vein and of the issue that you raise, I think, Natalie, which is that green means something different and looks very different in different contexts, and part of it has to do with your environment, with whether you're north or south, and whether it's a warm or a cold environment. And so we actually had to do a lot of thinking and qualifying what is a green space in Barcelona and what is a green space in Montreal, Canada. And are they comparable? Are they the same thing? And some of the dynamics you're talking about, the weather, the amount of sort of consumption-oriented activities that happen there, those have to be kind of all thought through differently in different places. We tried to arrive at a model that brings it all together, but there's some gray zone in there for sure.
Thank you. Lukas Schmitzer, please.
Okay. First, I also wanted to say thank you for the great input you gave us over the last 2 hours. It was really inspiring. Now to my question is, can you think of that this glizzy green urbanism also leads to new role models, like to new business models, which also in turn of give a bigger market competition, and this leads then to more affordable green spaces probably? Or do you also see this kind of way already?
I think that what you're saying is extremely desirable, and if you can find spin-off ways to create an economy of green that benefits different business structures. I think, the example of Connolly is really interesting. The ones in Nantes as well, where you have greening as part of a vertical integration of different companies, different sectors, between landscaping, stormwater management, agriculture, horticulture in particular, maintenance of space, designers of space, and all of this being very supported by a municipal department, again, that has a lot of funding. So is also able to give small business grants to those entrepreneurs. That works really well. I think in the cases that we talk about, the glitzy urbanism, unfortunately, is also named this way because it's very much greenwashing. If you take the example of Milano, with the Bosco Verticale, these buildings that James was showing, that are essentially made of gigantic piles of concrete with a varnish that happens to be green, that first does not imply climate change benefits. It has more cost than anything else in terms of resource drainage. But on top of it, it is so geared towards a sustainability luxury class that the spin-off is difficult to see from a positive social and environmental standpoint, I would say. But James, maybe you have a different way to think about it.
Sorry, no, I think that covers my thoughts as well.
Dagmar.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just wanted to jump in here again for just two thoughts that came up in this very interesting discussion. And the one thought is, I mean, greening is not per se, it doesn't survive in cities simply just being once planted. So we all know that the water issue will be a very big one, maybe the biggest one for our cities. And then, of course, green is in direct congruence to humans. All organisms need water, right? So this is also something. And here again, in the worst case, it could be another injustice issue when some communities or just part of the city can still have green because they still have water and others can't. So this is a big fear, actually, what I have. And we need projections, we need ideas. And also we need to be very serious. What green can we manage when taking climate projections seriously? This is something we're doing some modeling, quantification about, but also you have to think about how you transport this. What does it mean? What Lucas now asked, what new roles come in here? Water was not so much the case. It was mainly flood protection. You had too much water, but now I think where you have storage capacities, this kind of the sponges in the city. Oh wow, maybe they are the big new rich, right? You just need to know it, right? And another thing is, I started as a very left person in my adult life, so I'm still left, but I would say just a bit more into center. Anyhow, what I think from this time is, and I don't know whether this applies to gentrification in the many cities you both have investigated. When you have gentrification at a single place or places that are quite far away, and we all know that urban dwellers, they just live within their neighborhood, and they're sometimes very ignorant to what happens in some other neighborhoods that are a bit more distant. I always think this is the big, they are lucky, the investors, that they can count on this missing solidarity because it's not directly in the neighborhood of the other, so gentrification can happen scattered. And if it would be more information and a bit more, equally spread phenomenon, maybe this would cause much more solidarity to some protests again. And my question is, do you agree, or did you find something like this, missing solidarity maybe too? Thank you.
James, Isabelle, some closing words in answering this question.
That's very thought-provoking, Dagmar, and I would just say I don't have a clear answer in terms of the politics that would truly effectively counter this. But I would say that I agree completely that there is a divide and conquer element to how this works, which is to segment off neighborhoods and sort of make it all just about that and not about a kind of bigger picture question of what's happening in the city. And that's part of the dynamic for sure that we observe, I think, over and over again.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it's interesting, at least in Europe, is to see how little the environmental movement has been aware, or it has been in, let's say, strategic alliance with social groups that are fighting for housing rights.
Yes.
Because green gentrification is a newer phenomenon, as you say. It's maybe not as much in your face as it is in the US, but now that there is, for example, in the case of Barcelona or in the case of Dublin, a greater realization that that actually greening is not for everyone, and that greening will displace residents of a neighborhood where housing rights are also being fought for, then housing activists are starting to take that on as an agenda.
Yeah.
I think ecologists in Europe are still behind. And so for that alliance to take place is going to take more time, especially so at the citywide level. But in Nantes, for example, we saw this alliance of what they call, the grandiose projects of Nantes being contested. But it's still burgeoning, because in France, we don't organize around that. If there's a teacher strike, we get out. If there's a healthcare strike, but people are not enough on the streets for their neighborhood. And then for the citywide alliance, you have these huge trade unions. They're super powerful. They block our roads. But at the local level, they don't really have an influence.
Okay. Very interesting. Thank you both for that.
Seems that this is indeed one of the biggest challenges, to put stuff in relation to one another. And this intersectionality that you mentioned several times, also in the book, I think that's the key challenge for the future, also for us as scholars, to investigate and see if there are synergic effects or effects which are counteracting each other. And the pandemic and the war actually are something which distracts from these crucial issues. But as we said just before we began with Dagmar, the war is also environmentally not sustainable, not just humanly. And this missing link should be made more explicit, and that the social and the environmental are not separate. They are separate only analytically, but if you look closer to the issue is strongly connected. And we should overcome this fragmentation, this Cartesian way of dividing stuff by disciplines. So people working on cities have to have an interdisciplinary perspective, otherwise they don't understand cities. And that's why we have planners, we have geographers, we have economists, we have sociologists coming to our discussions, because we think it's a very fruitful and important dialogue to be established. But so I thank you very much for having contributed to this debate with this very nice presentation. And we will have a next book presentation on the 27th of April with Tom Slater, who will be presenting his last book, Shaking Up the City. So the conflictual element will come back again, also partly with gentrification, but not only. He's a very strong gentrification guy. But this book goes beyond that. And so you are all invited to join for the discussion there. And enjoy the rest of the evening.